understand this computer. Okay, hi everyone. As you all know, this meeting is recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube. So we have a couple of items on the agenda for today. The first one is proposed by Aldo. He would like to discuss where to place definitions of entry plugin configs. Take it away.
Yes, so this is coming from the updates that we are doing to Big One Alpha 2, in which pretty much the plugin configurations are moving deep in the stack of the startup sequence and deep in the code, as opposed to before, where it was defaults were in the configuration instantiation code. So yeah, basically it's getting a little bit obscure. So to mitigate that, I think in general we can solve this problem for any plugin, for out of 3 plugins, but we should at least make an effort to support validation and defaults for the default plugins. So the proposal there is to move the API definition for each plugin all the way up to the version folders, and that way we can first of all make it visible, make the arguments visible to users, and possibly add validation logic and and maybe conversion. We can do more things than we can do now. So.
Right, so just like to rephrase, so as you all know, for each plugin, we have a plugin config, and the plugin config right now in the component config API is basically like unknown. So that basically when you parse it, you know which exact struct that it corresponds to. And the suggestion here is that, like, what we are doing right now is those structs are basically defined with the plugin itself under framework plugins directory. And the proposal here is just to move those definitions to be under the scheduler APIs directory, because those are actually part of the API. When you create like a component config file and pass it to the scheduler, we should respect deprecation policy for those configurations. And so it makes a lot of sense to make them part of the API directory, although they are not going to be used anywhere. Like, we're not going to embed them in any configuration. They are just being, they just define the type that, like a plugin arg will be parsed into or decoded into. And so, yeah, that's basically what I wanted to add to what Aldo mentioned. Does that make sense? You have any concerns about this proposal?
Yeah, I'm okay with this proposal, and I suppose that this also set up the rule for the external users who use the framework. If they want to manage their arguments in a version way, they should follow this pattern.
Exactly.
Yeah. Them in the out of tree repository, in a version way. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is certainly, like, we definitely need to follow Kubernetes deprecation policy for these types, because they are part of the API. Having them like deep inside in the framework doesn't make things like obvious. And so placing them in staging as well and all that thing will force us to do the right thing when we try to update arguments and whatnot. Okay, so we agree on this one. That's great. So the second item is Mike want to propose migrating scheduler code to staging. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah. So this actually came up. I was talking to Ravi about it. It came up when we were working on the descheduler recently, trying to move that to Go modules and get everything updated, all its dependencies in Kubernetes. And we found that there were a lot of dependencies, either mostly transitively through scheduler code that was imported there, that ended up importing pretty much all of case.io/Kubernetes. So I put together the doc, which is in the agenda, and I just sent out to the SIG list too, that kind of outlines the proposal for moving our code from being under Kubernetes/package/scheduler to being under staging / I think we already have a staging directory where our config APIs are kube scheduler. So a big example for this that I point to a couple times in the doc is they did something similar with kubectl. They had all their code in package, I think kubectl, and just recently made a really similar move over to staging. I linked to their enhancement because a lot of their motivation was similar, if not the same as ours, which I also outlined in the doc. But the main idea is really just to make the scheduler more importable for external projects, and whether that's people that are using the scheduler framework, writing like custom schedulers, or just out of tree plugins that they want to compile at some point. Not depending on all of Kubernetes is really helpful for that, and also becomes difficult with Go modules to import K8s.io Kubernetes. I have a couple examples for why that's difficult. But I think in general, it's not, K8s.io Kubernetes isn't meant to be a Go module that you import the entire thing from.
I have a couple of questions about this or comments. So the first one is, when we say Kubernetes, K8s.io/Kubernetes/package, do we know what is the canonical code that should be placed there and what should not? Let me finish and then you can. So the second thing is, Kubernetes, the scheduler is actually just a client, right, of the API server. It's a client of Kubernetes. It's just a controller running. So like I support that move in the sense that shouldn't really depend on the core Kubernetes code. But that also depends on you answering the first question. What is the canonical piece of code that should reside in under like Kubernetes package? What does Kubernetes provide there?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I can't say definitively. I think that it kind of comes down to a debate over, like you said, what canonically should belong in the core Kubernetes repo. I think you can make a lot of arguments for breaking the scheduler out because it does run as a compiled command. It has flags that get taken to it or get passed to it when you run it. So in that sense, we are a controller that's part of Kubernetes, but we also, the default scheduler is its own thing, sort of.
I think we need to somehow answer or partially understand the first question.
Yeah.
And it is actually could be like, I know that kubectl was the first component to do that. But if we try to make it like a pattern or like the new standard, it might be a really good contribution from our SIG to bring people in to comment on what should reside where, for our own sanity understanding as well, as like, SIG leaders or SIG, people who are interested in and wants to take it further, and make sure that we understand how this whole thing should be structured, so that we can advise the contributors when they contribute code, and make the best decisions moving forward. Not just like, oh, we did it for CLI, so for kubectl, and so we have to do it on the scheduler.
Okay,
It's basically a little bit more informed process, I guess.
To shed some light, Mike brought the example of kubectl, but kubectl honestly was not the first to move into staging. Hopefully we will be the first to get out of the main Kubernetes repo, but that's a different story. And and truth to be told, the first to move into staging or split out for other consumers, where the API, the client go, and the API servers, up to the point where there's a API server and API server extensions. So I guess the question should not be what should reside inside of the main package directory in the Kubernetes repo, but rather, do we envision our component be a valuable library provider for other consumers? I spoke with Mike a little bit about it earlier this week, and as an intermediate option, we could also provide people with something like a scheduler framework. Maybe not necessarily we need to expose or move to the staging repository the entire scheduler, but at least the main scheduler bits, the framework, so-called, which will allow the other authors of plugins, other authors of full schedulers, reuse the same components that we are using inside of the Kube scheduler. So I would, and as an example, in kubectl, what we did is something called CLI runtime, which is a set of helpers that are useful for people building CLI plugins that just want to have a similar look and feel like the normal kubectl commands. And we as kubectl are the first consumer of that library, and it resides right next inside of the staging repository. So maybe not necessarily we need to extract the entire scheduler, but we should think about extracting into some kind of, I don't know, scheduler framework, scheduler library, whatever the name will be. It doesn't matter at this point in time. We should think about exposing this, because that part of the functionality will be helpful for others to write. If we know that we are using similar functionalities in the descheduler, I'm pretty sure that there will be other people that will benefit of that kind of library code.
Right. I mean, the cluster autoscaler is another example.
Right.
Yeah. I completely agree with you. Like, one of the things that I was also thinking about is how we version the framework, and we can't version it as long as it's, you know, under the package, because we provide zero guarantees there. I don't know. Like, leads me to the other question, which is, what guarantees or commitments are we going to adhere to moving forward if we provide this as a library? I honestly do not know, like deprecation policy and whatnot for library APIs, not like, you know, config and object APIs. Like, how is that different? Does Kubernetes have a policy for that? From your experience with API server and kubectl, how does that look?
Yeah, sure. So for kubectl, since kubectl was always a separate binary, a separate thing, we do maintain currently a ±1 version difference, version skew, and we are actually planning. One of the reasons that we went with a separate with staging and then eventually a separate repo is because we would like to release kubectl faster. But the faster will actually means that we need to increase the API guarantees. So it won't be 1, but it has to be at least at the current level. So if we start releasing every month, that means our version guarantees will have to go up that much. From what I've noticed, the majority of the API machinery libraries like Client Go, they should work without any problems between versions, but they have a one-to-one matching because Client Go has a different versioning scheme than the main Kubernetes. So they have a table. I think it's living at the root of the Client Go published repo, where they claim from which particular version this is working. But since this is building on top of the Kubernetes API, it's the API that it gives the guarantees. Our library, the scheduler library, would also be built on top of the APIs that you just talked before we entered this topic. So building on top of that, I'm guessing that it would be totally up to us to define the API guarantees. And I'm guessing just stating that we would be following the same guarantees as the main Kubernetes projects, and including the deprecation policies and whatnot, it would be a sufficient step forward.
I have one more question, but like if anyone has any, I don't want to take all the bandwidth.
I can't give valuable options, technical options right now, but in the user's perspective, I would think of it as necessary, especially that the kube control example is pretty similar, like what we use the scheduling plugin to consume the upstream code, right? We encourage the users to consume our framework, so it would be very beneficial for our external users. So right now, when I try to compose the scheduling plugin subrepo, I was also thinking about how to do the version matrix compatibility, how to define the rules there, and yeah, if we don't have a specific policy manage that would be difficult to manage along with the time going. So I just to express my opinion in user's perspective, I think it's beneficial. But we should define which stuff we should extract them into one time or yeah.
I think we just have to list all the use cases we have. Yeah. And I think so far the only use case is the framework and maybe the existing plugins. And that should be fairly simple to extract.
I mean, still, we didn't finish, like we finished moving the schedule to the framework, but there's still a ton of logic. The one that actually runs the framework, that is in not well factored out. Like I would imagine if someone wants to build their own scheduler using like a set of out of tree plugins, they need some logic to, for example, run the pre-filters, run the filters, run the pre-score, run the score, and all that jazz, right? Mm-hmm. This is still in multiple places in the scheduler. It's not properly factored out into what we call like an engine, for example, that we can right now move to, for example, a staging repo. I would imagine that the framework itself, which is basically an interface and an implementation for a bunch of functions, can be done, but you still need logic around it to actually execute those functions in the right order and make the right decisions, for example, the binding and all that. And this is what, for example, cluster or scalar does. This is probably what.
I agree with Abdullah. Those kind of template algorithm code which run the plugin should be stay in core internally. It's just the interface. For example, in 1.18, suppose we have renamed the, we have done yet, but we will rename the
right.
host post filter to prescore. For example, suppose version compatibility matrix, how to let the downstream users to
But I guess my point is, like, I think we might want to extract that out and make it a little bit like as part of the library, because that is also a lot of overhead for anyone who wants to build a scheduler to do. The framework itself is useless if you don't have the logic around it to actually run the framework.
So,
and it is not simple to do that.
I think we have two use cases here. One is things like the autoscaler and the descaler. I think they pretty much can run just using the framework.
Yeah.
I could be wrong. And then we have the other use case, which is I want to build a custom scheduler.
Yeah.
And I think that one is going to be harder, and we can do it as a second stage.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, so I totally agree with this approach. I mean, it's not something that we need to do right away.
Mm-hmm.
I was rather, and I think Mike's approach was rather, this is a long-term goal. And like, there's definitely a lot of the scheduler internals that I would not want to expose in any way. I would prefer them live inside of the main repo, and that's perfectly fine. But there's nothing stopping us from doing this incrementally.
Yeah, the big goal of this is to do it in steps at the very least. And
yeah, the interfaces, exposing the interfaces and the helper functions. I don't know what that could be, but I'm pretty sure that my way could come up with at least a handful of list of those. This could be a good starting point. And the interfaces, yes, to start with, the interfaces would be a good thing. And then as we go, we could build this library to something bigger and eventually decide where we will draw the line between what will forever stay in the core and what might be useful. I'm not saying that all the plugins should go into that library, that all of the core components should go in that library. No, I would rather think small and then incrementally build the stuff that we think other people will benefit. And to answer one other statement, you might be surprised to learn how much coupling you will have once you actually start doing the split. And we learned the hard way, and you can talk to API machinery folks. They learned the hard way as well. Every single time there is this kind of a split going on, you'll learn that you have a lot of code that is tightly coupled to the kube internals. And that's not necessarily has to be that way. So the extraction is also a good way to refactor some of the bits that, will benefit the code hygiene in the long run.
Yeah, that is another good point that I think I mentioned in the doc, is that at the very least, trying to decouple a lot of our dependencies on the internal packages can be a good refactoring effort to take on.
There are a ton of advantages we can think of when we do this. One thing that might be like, just in terms of like trying to brainstorm and playing devil's advocate here, one concern that I have with this is the increased commitment on our side. And it's not because like I don't want to do extra work, it's because it might slow us down in terms of development. So this is something we need to balance. We don't want to take into a responsibility that is not widely used, that would, slow us down in terms of how we develop our default scheduler and how fast we can move with the features. If, for example, moving into a staging repo requires us to adhere to specific, deprecation policy that is too strict, and it would, instead of releasing a feature in 1 or 2 releases, it's going to take us like much longer. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't do it because of that. It's just we want to be careful with this, what we exactly move to the staging, how we craft our deprecation policy to allow this good balance between our commitment to the community and at the same time velocity of feature development. So this is something for the your document, Mike, as well, like to also, I guess, start a discussion there as well. How can we balance that? And also explicitly start discussing the deprecation part. This is my main concern, to be honest, like with this whole thing, how we maintain compatibility and what is our commitment moving forward as a library.
Okay, so I'll make notes for that, and that's discussion that can be had in the doc or offline on the mailing list. I'm sure that other people will have.
Yeah, and just give examples of like the API server, what they are doing, or kubectl, what they are doing, and maybe we can add people who actually went through that process and get their perspective and experience, like how did that work out for them? What was the right balance? Maybe whatever they're using right now is something that didn't work out very well, and they would have liked to change it if they had to start over. So we don't necessarily need to exactly copy what everybody has done already. Okay. Anyone has any other like feedback or comments? We're almost out of time, or we are out of time. Anyone has any like comments other than the two topics we discussed? Would like to raise? All right. Thank you so much. We discussed before, like that the 5 p.m. Meeting is optional because unless we have an agenda item, I'm gonna but I will every week I'm gonna send an email to cancel it. But just like an understanding that this is going to be optional moving forward, as long as we don't have agenda items. Thank you. See you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.